date is September 19, 1944. But before we witness this battle, understand this terrifying truth: we are losing the war against time. Every single day, the algorithms bury these stories, and the heroism of this generation faces total erasure. If you don't act this second, this history dies with you. Subscribe immediately. Do not think twice to stop these stories from vanishing forever. And for those of you who refuse to help preserve this legacy, go to the comments section right now and lament exactly why you won't subscribe to honor these men. Now, to the mist-covered hills of the Lorraine region in France. Here, the brutalities of mechanized warfare are about to reach a fever pitch. On the ground, the terrifying distinct rattle of tracks signals the approach of the 5th Panzer Army. Their objective is simple: crush the overextended flank of General Patton's 3rd Army and halt the Allied advance into Germany. Facing them is a terrifying mismatch of machinery. The Germans possess the Tiger and the Panther steel behemoths with armor thick enough to shrug off standard Allied rounds and guns capable of killing from 2 kilometers away. The Americans, dug in and desperate, are waiting for air support that is not coming. The heavy overcast sky has grounded the P-47 Thunderbolts, the flying tanks that usually keep the German armor at bay. Without air cover, the American ground units are sitting ducks, but hovering above the battlefield, buzzing like an angry insect in the gray sky, is a frantic anomaly. It is not a fighter plane. It is not a bomber. It is a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a tiny fabric-skinned reconnaissance plane, with a top speed of barely 85 miles per hour. It has no armor plate. It has no heavy machine guns. Its pilot carries a service pistol and a map. By all laws of warfare, this aircraft is prey. But on this day, the predator would become the hunted. As the German columns advanced, confident in their immunity from the air, they looked up to see the impossible. The tiny spotter plane banked sharply, its wings groaning under the weight of a modification that shouldn't exist. Attached to the fragile struts were not cameras, but 6 infantry bazookas. What happened next was not just an act of desperation. It was an act of insanity that would rewrite the rulebook of aerial combat. When the heavy air support failed to arrive, one man decided to take on the heavy armor himself. This is the story of Rosie the Rocketer and the pilot who went to war with a flying bicycle. To understand the sheer audacity of this moment, we must first understand the man and the machine. Major Charles Carpenter was not your typical hotshot fighter ace. He was 32 years old, a former history teacher and football coach from Urbana, Illinois. He was a man of intellect and patience, traits that suited his role as an artillery observation pilot perfectly. Carpenter belonged to the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army. By the autumn of 1944, the 3rd Army was tearing across France at a breakneck pace. They had broken out of Normandy, raced across the Brittany Peninsula, and were now charging toward the German border. The speed of the advance was legendary, but it came at a cost. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, fuel was running low, and the flanks of the narrow American advance were dangerously exposed. In this high-speed war, information was ammunition. This was the job of the L-4 Grasshopper. The L-4 was the military version of the Piper J-3 Cub. It was a masterpiece of simplicity. Constructed of steel tubing covered in cotton fabric, powered by a 65-horsepower Continental engine, it was essentially a kite with a propeller. A strong man could punch his fist through the fuselage. A single rifle bullet could sever a control cable or ignite the fuel tank located directly behind the engine firewall. Its doctrine was strict: observe and report. L-4 pilots were the eyes of the artillery. They would circle high above the battlefield, spot enemy concentrations, and radio coordinates back to the 105 mm and 155 mm howitzer batteries miles to the rear. They were explicitly forbidden from engaging the enemy. Their defense was their slow speed and maneuverability. They could fly low and slow, hiding behind tree lines and hills, places where fast German fighters couldn't follow without crashing. But Charles Carpenter was growing frustrated. As the 4th Armored pushed into the Lorraine Campaign, The resistance hardened. The retreat of the Wehrmacht had stopped. Hitler had ordered a counteroffensive. The Germans were reorganizing, bringing up their heavy panzer brigades. Carpenter, flying daily sorties, would often spot German convoys, armored cars, and tanks moving through the woods. He would call for artillery, but often the batteries were moving, out of range, or conserving ammunition. He was forced to watch, helpless, as German armor maneuvered to ambush his friends on the ground. The feeling of impotence was suffocating. Carpenter wasn't content to just watch history happen. As a history teacher, he knew that sometimes individuals had to force the hand of fate. It started as a joke, then an experiment. While stationed at an airfield near Lorient during the Siege of Brittany, Carpenter looked at the struts of his fragile plane. He looked at the M1 Bazooka, carried by the infantry, a shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that fired a 2.36-inch shaped charge rocket. Why not? He thought. With the help of an ordnance technician and a few skeptical mechanics, they rigged two bazookas to the underwing struts of his plane, wiring the ignition triggers into the cockpit. They named the plane Rosie the Rocketer, a nod to the cultural icon Rosie the Riveter. Most pilots thought he was suicidal. The backblast of a bazooka could tear the fabric off the tail. The weight would make the already underpowered plane sluggish. But Carpenter was determined. He wasn't just going to spot the enemy anymore. He was going to hunt them. By mid-September 1944, the weather in Lorraine had turned against the Allies. The clear summer skies were replaced by the heavy, low-hanging fog and incessant rain of a European autumn. For the Third Army, this was a disaster. The U.S. Army relied heavily on air supremacy. The massive P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with bombs and rockets, were the hammer that smashed German armor. But P-47 seconds needed visibility. Ground fog meant the Thunderbolts were grounded. And the Germans knew it. Under the cover of this meteorological shield, General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, launched a massive counterstroke. His goal was to sever the 4th Armored Division near the town of Ericourt. He committed huge numbers of brand-new Panther tanks machines that were superior in armor and firepower to the American M4 Shermans. The morning of September 19th dawned gray and wet. The ceiling was zero. At the forward airstrips, the P-47 pilots sat in their cockpits, engines cold, cursing the fog. The request for air support was constant over the radio channels. Tank concentrations spotted, taking heavy fire, need immediate air cover. But the tower's response was always the same: negative. Weather is 0 to 0. All flights grounded. On the ground, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The American tank destroyers, armed with 76mm guns, were rushing to plug gaps in the line, but they were outnumbered. German Panthers were using the mist to ambush American columns from close range. The chaos was absolute. The 4th Armored was in danger of being overrun. At the tiny liaison strip, Major Carpenter stood by, Rosie the Rocketer. By now, he had upgraded his armament. He wasn't carrying 2 bazookas anymore. He had installed 6.3 mounted in a cluster on each wing strut. It was a heavy load for the little 65-horsepower engine. The plane sat low on its landing gear, looking almost ridiculous, like a toy loaded with firecrackers. But the situation was dire. A radio report crackled in. A column of German heavy armor had been spotted moving along a wooded ridge, flanking a pinned-down unit of American infantry and light tanks. The artillery was busy with other targets. The Air Force was grounded. There was no one else. Carpenter looked at his crew chief. "Prop her," he said. The engine sputtered to life, the propeller becoming a blur in the mist. The L-4 bounced across the muddy grass field, struggling to gain speed with the extra weight of the rocket tubes. It lifted off sluggishly, barely clearing the tree line at the end of the runway. Carpenter banked the plane toward the sound of the guns. As he climbed, the fog wrapped around him. He had to fly dangerously low, sometimes under 200 feet just to see the ground. This altitude was suicidal. At this height, he was within range of everything from German 20mm flak cannons to individual soldiers with Mauser rifles. The fabric of his plane offered less protection than a heavy winter coat. Little did the Germans know, the angel of death approaching them wasn't a roaring metal dragon, but a buzzing fabric kite. By 1400 hours, Carpenter was over the combat zone. The scene below was a muddy hellscape. Burning hulks of Sherman tanks sent black smoke mixing with the fog. Tracers zipped through the mist. Through breaks in the clouds, Carpenter scanned the ground. His eyes, trained by years of observation, looked for the telltale geometric shapes that didn't belong in nature. There, partially concealed by a line of poplars, he saw them. 2 Mark V Panther tanks and several armored half-tracks. They were maneuvering to strike the side of an American tank destroyer platoon that was completely unaware of their presence. The Germans were buttoned up, focused on the ground battle ahead. They weren't looking up. Why would they? The Luftwaffe had assured them the Allied J-bows, the fighter bombers, could not fly in this weather. Carpenter checked his switches. He had no gun sight. He had no targeting computer. He had a grease pencil mark on his windshield and his own intuition. He reached up and armed the battery packs for the bazookas. He pushed the stick forward. The Grasshopper didn't dive so much as it slid down the air. The engine RPM increased, a high-pitched whine that was easily lost in the din of battle. He was going to attack a 45-ton tank with a flying bicycle. The distance closed rapidly. 1,000 yards. 800 yards. Carpenter lined up the lead Panther. The tank was a monster, its sloped frontal armor virtually impervious to most ground fire. But Carpenter knew tank anatomy. The top armor, the engine deck, and the turret roof was thin. That was the Achilles heel. But to hit it, he had to get close. Impossible close. The effective range of a bazooka was only a few hundred yards. On the ground, soldiers had to be brave to fire one. In the air, trying to account for the speed of the plane and the drop of the rocket, it was an exercise in geometry and guts. At 500 yards, the Germans finally noticed him. A commander popped out of the cupola of the second tank, binoculars raised. He must have been confused. A liaison plane? Here? Doing what? Then he saw the tubes. Machine gun fire erupted from the German column. The MG-34S and MG-42S ripped into the sky. Tracers flashed past Carpenter's cockpit. He could hear the snap hiss of bullets tearing through the fabric wings. One lucky hit to the engine, and he would plummet into the enemy formation. One hit to the pilot, and it was over. Carpenter didn't flinch. He held the dive. The ground rushed up mud, steel, and terrified faces became visible. 300 yards, 200 yards. Now, he whispered. He toggled the switch. Whoosh! A rocket streaked out from the right strut, leaving a trail of white smoke. Carpenter immediately yanked the stick back and kicked the rudder hard. The L-4 groaned, banking steeply away just as the rocket impacted. It was a near miss. The rocket exploded in the mud just inches from the Panther's tracks, sending a shower of dirt and shrapnel over the hull. The tank shuddered but kept moving. The element of surprise was gone. The entire German column turned their anti-aircraft machine guns skyward. The air around Rosie the rocketer filled with lead. Carpenter flew erratically, jinking left and right, the little plane dancing through the storm of fire. He should have turned back. He had disrupted them. He had done his duty. But Carpenter wasn't done. He had 5 rockets left. He circled around, using a small hill to mask his approach. He climbed again, the engine straining. He was going to attack the same column, now fully alerted, from a different angle. This time, the Germans were ready. The sky was a wall of tracer fire. Yet, Carpenter dove again. The sheer madness of it seemed to paralyze the enemy gunners. For a split second, they were trying to shoot down a mosquito with a sledgehammer. He lined up the second Panther. He corrected for the wind. He waited until he could see the rivets on the turret. 100 yards. Point-blank range. He fired 2 rockets in rapid succession. Whoosh, whoosh. The first rocket went slightly high. The second struck the Panther squarely on the engine deck. The shaped charge warhead detonated. A jet of molten copper, superheated to thousands of degrees, punched through the thin top armor of the German tank. It sliced into the engine compartment, igniting fuel and ammunition. A catastrophic explosion ripped the Panther apart from the inside. The turret, weighing several tons, lifted momentarily off the ring. A pillar of black, oily smoke erupted into the gray sky. Carpenter pulled up so hard the G-force pinned him to his seat. He looked back over his shoulder. The Panther was a burning pyre. The German column had stopped dead. The crews of the other vehicles were bailing out, diving into ditches, terrified that they were under attack by a squadron of fighter bombers. They couldn't believe a single Grasshopper had done this. Panic gripped the German unit. The momentum of their flank attack was shattered. But the crisis wasn't over. Carpenter saw more armor moving up. He had 3 rockets left, and he was angry. For the next several hours, a surreal duel played out over the fields of Ericourt. Major Carpenter didn't just strike once and go home. He landed at the forward strip, shouting for the ground crew to reload. "Give me more rockets," he yelled over the engine noise. The mechanics, working with frantic speed, wired up fresh bazooka rounds. They patched the bullet holes in the wings with duct tape and dope. Carpenter drank a cup of coffee, checked his map, and went back up. He returned to the fray, again and again. On his 3rd sortie of the day, he spotted a German armored car section pinning down a U.S. infantry squad. The soldiers were trapped in a drainage ditch, pinned by 20mm cannon fire. They looked up to see the L-4 descending like an avenging angel. Carpenter came in at treetop level. He fired a rocket into the lead-armored car. The vehicle disintegrated. He swung around and fired at a tank hiding in a barn. The barn collapsed, burying the armor. The psychological impact on the Germans was devastating. They were used to fighting other tanks. They were used to hiding from thunderbolts. They had no doctrine for fighting a madman in a canvas kite who refused to go away. The fear of the Mad Major, as he would later be known, spread through the enemy radio networks. By late afternoon, the fog began to lift slightly, but the damage was done. The German flanking maneuver near Ericourt had stalled. The confusion sown by Carpenter allowed the American tank destroyers to reposition. They ambushed the remaining German armor, decimating the Panzer Brigade. In one specific engagement that day, Carpenter is credited with forcing an entire German armored column to retreat. They assumed that where there was one spotter plane firing rockets, a massive airstrike must be seconds away. They withdrew to the cover of the heavy forests, ceding the battlefield to the Americans. When Carpenter finally landed for the last time that evening, his plane was a wreck. Rosie the Rocketer was riddled with bullet holes. There was shrapnel embedded in the seat cushion. The engine was leaking oil. He climbed out of the cockpit, his face smeared with exhaust and sweat, his legs shaking from the adrenaline dump. A general from the 4th Armored Division approached him. "Major," the general said, looking at the battered plane and the empty bazooka tubes. "You just took on a Panzer division with a slingshot." Carpenter lit a cigarette, his hand trembling slightly. "Someone had to do it, sir." That day, the legend of Bazooka Charlie was cemented in history, but the numbers tell an even more incredible story. By the end of the war, Major Charles Carpenter and his faithful L-4 Grasshopper were officially credited with destroying 6 German tanks, including 2 heavy Tiger I tanks and several armored cars. This score would make him an ace, but a tank ace, flying a plane that wasn't designed to carry so much as a heavy suitcase. His actions at Ericourt and throughout the campaign proved a vital point. American ingenuity and individual initiative were weapons as potent as any heavy tank. When the system failed, when the weather turned, when the odds were impossible, a history teacher from Illinois improvised a solution that saved countless American lives. The press dubbed him the Mad Major. The Stars and Stripes newspaper ran headlines about the bazooka plane. But to the men on the ground, the infantry shivering in foxholes, and the tanker crews outgunned by German steel, he was a guardian angel. Carpenter survived the war. He returned to civilian life, struggling with illness later in life, passing away in 1966. For decades, his story was largely forgotten, overshadowed by the flashy tales of Mustang pilots and B-17 crews. However, in recent years, the actual Rosie the Rocketer aircraft was found in Austria, restored to its flying condition, and returned to the skies, a testament to the courage of a man who refused to accept that he was helpless. The Battle of Aricourt was a decisive victory for the U.S. Army, proving that their combined arms tactics could defeat the superior German heavy armor. But amidst the movements of divisions and corps, it was the buzz of a 65-horsepower engine that turned the tide in the fog. Major Carpenter showed the world that it isn't the size of the weapon that counts, but the spirit of the warrior wielding it. Major Charles Carpenter's duel with the Panzers is a reminder that history is often made by those who break the rules to do what is right. It stands as one of the most unique and heroic chapters of aerial warfare. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Lost Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. From the mud of the trenches to the clouds above, we will ensure that the sacrifices of this generation are never forgotten.